So this is an episode of Scott Talks Law, and welcome once again to another episode of Scott Talks Law. So in this episode, shall be talking about the completion stage in property conveyancing, the stage that comes after the contractual stage. So property law 2 mainly deals with conveyancing. So we talked about the modes of property conveyancing by inheritance, possession, and by prescription and transfer. So those modes of property conveyancing. We also talked about the pre-contract stage that involves a lot of search, and the contractual stage where the parties enter into a contractual agreement, the purchaser and the vendor. So this is the completion stage that comes after the contractual stage. So there is no general definition of as to what completion is, but according to the LSK conditions of sale, completion refers to the act of transferring property from the vendor to the purchaser for consideration, the act of completing the transfer of property. So that act of completing the transfer of property ownership, according to the LSK condition, is referred to as completion stage. So a completion date is that date that is fixed by the parties either during that during that agreement or before that agreement, and this is usually 90 days after the agreement. So the completion date shall be stipulated in that contractual agreement. So the vendor who is selling this property shall obtain the consent of various authorities before transferring this property or possession to the owner, before completing these completion documents. So this vendor is supposed to obtain various consent. He can obtain the marriage consent if this is a matrimonial property. He must have the consent of the other spouse. It's a spousal property. He must have that spousal consent, where he has the consent of other property. The other spouse must be aware that this person is intending to sell this property. He must obtain the consent of the Land Registration Act. He must obtain the consent of the Kenya Railways Board if this is land or property that neighbors the railway company. Must obtain the consent of Kenya Airports Authority if this is a property that is close to an airport. He must obtain those consents. So he can also obtain the consent of the Kenya Airports Authority, Kenya Railways Authority. Can also, before this transfer, he must also have registrations. He must have that land rates and land rent registrations. So this vendor must obtain the registration before transferring this piece of property. So he must have that registration certificate to ensure, just to confirm that he has paid all the rates and rents that are associated with that piece of property. So the purchaser will pay the purchase price, the balance of the purchase price, and this can be through a professional undertaking. So a professional undertaking is where the advocates are involved. The vendor's advocate and the purchaser's advocates are involved. So the money shall be transferred from the purchaser's account to the vendor's advocate's account to be held as a stakeholder. So this vendor's advocates act as a stakeholder to just hold this money before the completion agreement or the completion documents are signed by the parties. So that is through a professional undertaking where money is held by the vendor's advocates, or the advocates are involved when the balance of the purchase price or before the balance of the purchase price is paid. So the completion means the act of completing the sale of property for consideration, and this may include the transferring either by registration or otherwise. So the vendor can transfer the property either by registration or any other way of transferring. By granting legal possession, he can grant legal possession or ownership to that purchaser by giving him the title of ownership. He can also do this by statements of utility bills and transfer of utility accounts. So any bills that is associated with that property, the vendor is supposed to settle all the utility bills and transfer all the utility accounts. Appointments of outgoings between the vendor and the purchaser. Outgoings include all land rates and rates usually are payable annually. So on completion, the purchaser pays the vendor the balance of the purchase price and transfers the interest of property to the owner. So the completion documents shall be given upon completion. The completion documents shall be given to the purchaser. So during a professional undertaking, these parties shall agree the venue where this professional undertaking shall take place, or the time as to when this professional undertaking shall take place. But if it's not agreed by the party, this is usually at the vendor's advocate's office. So that professional undertaking usually happens at the vendor's advocate's office. So we have obligations of both parties, both the purchaser and the vendor. So the purchaser is supposed to pay the balance of the purchase price, and this balance of the purchase price can be paid through a professional undertaking where advocates are involved. So this professional undertaking, the purchaser's advocate shall transfer the money to the vendor's advocate's bank account. So this vendor's advocate shall act as a stakeholder to hold that money during that completion, before the completion of that sale agreement. So this vendor's advocate shall just hold that money during that time when the completion agreement is in progress. So let's look at the obligation of the vendor. So the obligation of the vendor is supposed to obtain all the consent, all the relevant consent, the consent of the National Land Commission, the consent of the so the vendor's obligation include the release of the purchaser the complete document. So the vendor is supposed to release complete documents to the purchaser, or the complete documents. So he must release the original title to that piece of property. He must execute the transfer in triplicate. So original valid land rates, clearance certificate. So these clearance certificates are obtained from the land registration, maybe from the land registration of your county registration. So just to confirm that he has paid all the rates that are associated with that piece of land. And he must also so the original valid land rates clearance certificate for at least 21 days, together with the original rates and rent clearance certificate for the rates for the last 3 years, and original valid rent clearance certificate and receipt overriding the payment of rent. So the copies of the latest utility bills for water and electricity. So you must have the copies of the utility bills that confirm that all the waters and electricity have been paid for. Complete the copies of the vendor's identification documents, the copies of the KRA PIN certificate, just to confirm that he was paying the taxes that are associated with that piece of property. Three colored size passports, and 3 passport sized photographs of the vendor. So all the passports must be given. So the vendor is a company, a copy of the vendor's certificate of incorporation and copies of identification documents, passport photos, and KRA PIN certificate of the vendor and the director where it's a company. So all the consents, including the spousal consent, consent of the National Land Commission, consent of the National Land Commission, the consent of the county government, the county government's consent, the relevant government agency certifying that all the outstanding rates and other charges in respect to the land is produced to him. So the documents is referred to as the clearance certificate. So this consent must be obtained, and the clearance certificate must also be issued. So the consent must be obtained. So let's look at the relevant consent that must be obtained by the vendor. So the relevant consent. So before we look at the consent, let's look at clearance. On clearance, so on clearance, this vendor is supposed to obtain the clearance certificate, the land rates clearance certificate, and the land rent clearance certificate from various authorities, just to affirm that this person has been paying all the rents and the rates associated with that piece of property. So under the land rates clearance certificate, it's issued by an appropriate county government authority, and in whose the land area is situated. So if this land is situated between the municipalities of Nairobi County Government, then you must obtain that clearance certificate from the county government of Nairobi, where that land is issued or situated. So this satisfies that all the land rates are payable to the county government in respect to that piece of property. So it's mandatory to obtain a land rates clearance certificate before a transfer is presented for registration. So they cannot register this, the land registration board cannot register this piece of property if you haven't you haven't obtained those clearance certificates. So section 38 subsection 1 of the Land Registration Act 2012 states that the registrar shall not register a transfer unless a written statement by the relevant government agency certify that all the outstanding rates and other charges in respect to that land is produced to him. So the document is referred to as the land rates clearance certificate. So in respect to the land rent clearance certificate, all the leaseholds, all the leaseholds from the government are subject to payment of annual rent by the grantee of the lease. So all the leaseholds that are subject to the government are supposed to be paid. All the leaseholds are supposed to be paid by the grantee of the lease. By annual payment is supposed to be paid. So this requirement is found in the special conditions contained in the titled document. So at section 39 subsection 1 of the Land Registration Act 2012 provides that the registrar shall not register an instrument purporting to transfer or create interests in land unless a certificate is produced certifying that no rent owing to the national or county government in respect to that land is there. So the certificate is just to confirm that there is no rent that is associated with that piece of land. You can also see section 55 and 56 of the Land Registration Act 2012. So you can also note that this clearance certificate and the land rates clearance and rent clearance certificate was amended. That section was amended, and you can just transfer this piece of property without consideration of that rate and rent clearance certificate. So the requirement of the land rate and rent clearance certificate has since been repealed by the Business Law Amendment Act 2012. So it's therefore upon parties to agree on the issues of rates and rents by the buyer. So that section was repealed. So on consent, the vendor must obtain consent of various authorities before he transfers this piece of property. So the transaction in land requires certain consent before the documents relating can be registered. So the following consents are pertinent. So the consent of the Land Controls Board, and this is governed by the Land Controls Act Cap 302. So the purpose of this act is to control the transaction in agricultural land, and the transaction in question refers to as a controlled transaction. So section 5.2 of Land Registration of the Land Controls Act defines agricultural land to mean land land not within the municipality or township, land that is not within the town or municipality, any area which was a town under the township, the land that is not within any area which was in a town under the township ordinance, and land not within any area which was a trading center under the trading center. So the land which is not a market, land which is not a trading center, land which is not in a town, land in Nairobi area is land which is not in Nairobi area is an agricultural land or municipality or township or urban center declared by the notice of the Gazette. So the consent of the National Land Controls Board must be obtained by the vendor before this land certificate, before the registration of that piece of land. So another consent is the consent of the National Land Commission. You must also obtain the consent of the National Land Commission, and according to section 56 subsection 4 of the Land Registration Act 2012. So consent of the Kenya Railways Corporation, where the property in question is adjacent to the railway line. The consent of the Kenya Ports Authority dealing with any land bordering the port or harbor in Kenya, so falling under the jurisdiction of Kenya. The consent of the Kenya Airports Authority. The consent of the chargee. So the chargee must obtain the consent of the So the chargee must obtain the consent of the chargee before the transfer or the lease of charge. So the consent of the lessee or the lessor, the spousal consent is also another type of consent. So guys, that is the end of my lecture about the completion stage, and this is the stage that involves the transfer of property. Is an stage in conveyancing. The LSK conditions of sale defines this completion stage as the stage that involves the transfer of property, of ownership in property before the act of completing the sale of property for consideration pursuant to the agreement, that act of completing the sale of property for consideration. So that is the end of my lecture.